The last rays of sunlight clung to the western hills like fading embers as the train screeched into the dusty town of Ash Bluff. The whistle cut sharp through the cooling air, drawing long shadows across the wooden platform. Elijah Carter stood with his hands jammed deep in the pockets of a weathered coat, the brim of his hat low over his brow. There were no crowds, no porters, no family reunions, just the wind and the ache in his chest. He hadn't meant to be there. Then he saw her. She moved like smoke, slow, uncertain, and barely held together. "Please," she whispered, "don't let him take me back." Elijah crouched beside her. "Ain't nobody taking you anywhere." The whistle faded into the wind, leaving only silence and dust in its wake. The platform cleared quickly after the train's departure, townsfolk hurrying to homes, wagons creaking under worn wheels, and ranch hands dispersing like tumbleweeds caught in opposing gusts. Only Lydia Boone remained, curled where she had collapsed, one arm draped over her stomach, the other extended toward her dropped suitcase. Elijah Carter hadn't meant to move. He hadn't even realized he was striding toward her until he knelt at her side. The sun dipped lower behind the hills, casting her features in warm, bruised gold. Blood crusted at her temple. Her dress, what was left of it, was torn at the seams, soaked through with travel grime and desperation. The faint scent of iron and sweat clung to her like an accusation. "Miss," Elijah said softly, not wanting to startle her, "can you hear me?" Her lips parted, barely audible. "Don't send me back. Not please help me. Not where am I. Just that. Don't send me back." Elijah's throat tightened. "No one's sending you anywhere," he said, though he wasn't sure it was true. He looked around. A few townspeople hovered at a distance. Sheriff Tomlinson stood near the water trough, jaw set. Elijah had known that look before. Calculation and concern, tangled like barbed wire. "She yours?" Tomlinson asked, stepping closer. He wasn't accusing yet, but it was coming. "No," Elijah answered, standing slowly. "But she's in trouble." Tomlinson's eyes narrowed. "Trouble's not what this town needs more of." "I'm not asking what the town needs," Elijah said, voice firm. "I'm telling you what I'm doing. She needs help. I've got room. I'll take her." The sheriff studied him a moment longer. Elijah was no stranger to town gossip. Folks talked about how he still hadn't fixed the windows in the chapel after his wife's passing, about how he spent more time with horses than people, about the fact that he hadn't been to church since the funeral. "You sure, Eli?" Tomlinson finally said, scratching his jaw. "She might not be what she seems. Women don't end up like that unless they're running from something mean." Elijah looked down at the woman again, at her torn blue dress, her too thin wrists, her trembling breath. "I know," he said, "and I've got more reason than most to know the kind of man who causes that." He gathered her into his arms. She stirred weakly but didn't speak again. Her head lolled against his shoulder like a child too tired to pretend strength. He carried her to his wagon, ignoring the murmurs that rose in his wake. Some folks watched with pity, others with suspicion, but no one stepped forward to help. Tomlinson called out one last warning as Elijah climbed onto the bench beside her. "If there's trouble that follows, it's yours to clean up." "It already is," Elijah said. The ride out of town was slow. Lydia drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring half-coherent fragments. Names he didn't recognize, prayers half said, apologies he didn't understand. He kept one hand on the reins and the other on her shoulder, steadying her each time the wagon jolted over a rut. By the time the ranch came into view, dusk had settled like smoke over the hills. The Carter place wasn't much to look at anymore. The barn leaned like an old drunk. The corral gate hung askew, but the roof didn't leak, and the walls kept out most of the wind. And more importantly, it was quiet. He parked the wagon near the porch and lifted her again. She was even lighter than he remembered. Her skin radiated heat, fever, most likely. He nudged the door open with his foot and carried her inside. The house smelled of dry timber and cold ashes. Elijah laid her on the cot in the corner room, the one that had belonged to Sarah once. He hadn't touched it in months. Dust coated the windowsill. The quilt was still folded at the end of the bed, sun-faded but whole. He fetched water from the basin and soaked a cloth, gently wiping the grime from Lydia's face. As the dirt came away, her features sharpened. Hollow cheeks, a soft jaw, lashes too long for the bruises beneath them. "What happened to you?" he asked quietly, not expecting an answer. Her eyes fluttered open for a moment. "Did I die?" "No, ma'am," he said. "You made it." Her lip trembled. Then her eyes rolled back, and she slipped again into unconsciousness. He sat back on his heels. She needed food, a doctor, clean clothes. He had some of that. He'd figure out the rest. But first he had to tell someone. Word would spread by morning, but better it come from him. He took one last look at the woman lying in his spare bed, whoever she was, whatever she carried, and stepped out onto the porch. The stars were just starting to show, pale and flickering, like they weren't sure if they belonged here yet. He understood the feeling. By morning, Lydia was burning with fever. Elijah sat beside the bed, the creak of the chair beneath him the only sound in the room. He changed her bandage twice, each time gentler than the last. She hadn't stirred beyond a few low murmurs in her sleep, words muddled by pain or memory. He couldn't tell. He'd heard names. Mama, Ruthie. No, please don't. Followed by something that sounded like a prayer or a plea. He hadn't lit the stove in the kitchen yet. Couldn't bring himself to leave her alone that long. The light outside the window was weak, winter thin despite being spring. He'd meant to ride to town this morning, speak with the doc or maybe Tomlinson, but the thought of leaving her unsettled him in a way he didn't like to admit. She stirred around mid-morning, not all at once, but in slow, blinking pieces. Her hand twitched first, then her head turned slightly against the pillow. Elijah leaned in. "You're safe," he said quietly. "No one's going to hurt you here." Her gaze found him, dazed and glassy. For a long time she said nothing. Then her dry lips parted. "Where am I?" "My ranch," he replied. "About 10 miles from town." Her brows pinched. "Town?" "Sweetwater Ridge," he said. "Wyoming territory. You got off the train yesterday evening. Fainted on the platform. I remember." She paused, her voice hoarse. "You were there." "I was." She blinked again. "Why?" Elijah hesitated. 1,000 reasons swirled in his head. None of them pretty. None of them neat. "Didn't feel right letting you fall," he said finally. A faint broken sound escaped her. A laugh maybe, or a sob. She tried to sit up, then winced and fell back against the pillow. "Easy," he said, rising to pour water into a chipped mug. He held it to her lips. She drank with small, slow sips. Her hands trembled so hard the cup rattled. When she finished, he set it aside. "You told me your name was Lydia Harper." "I did," she said. There was a pause. A small flicker of guilt crossed her face, visible even beneath the bruise blooming along her jaw. Elijah folded his arms. "Was it true?" She looked away. "Part of it." He waited. She didn't continue. "I'm not here to judge," he said after a beat, "but I need to know if someone's coming for you." She swallowed hard. "Someone might be." "That man you mentioned at the station?" She didn't answer, but the way her jaw clenched was answer enough. "He hurt you?" Still nothing, but her hand went to the bandage at her side. Elijah nodded slowly. "Then we don't need his name." I wasn't supposed to be on that train," she whispered. "It was meant for someone else. My sister." His brows lifted slightly. She was the one who agreed to be a mail-order bride. She had the letters, the contract, but she got scared last minute. Her voice cracked. "I didn't want her to go alone. I thought if I just rode with her to the station, I could help her stay calm. But then, he saw me, the man who paid for her, and he decided he wanted me instead." The confession sat heavy in the space between them. "He threatened my family," Lydia said, her voice shaking. "Said he'd ruin them if I didn't get on that train. And your sister? Back home, safe, as long as he thinks I'm his." Elijah exhaled slowly. "That why you're running?" Lydia nodded once. "You're not his," he said. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I know that now." He stood and moved to the window, pushing aside the curtain just enough to glance at the horizon. "I've known men like that," he muttered. "Ones who think they can buy people the way they buy land or horses." Silence. When he turned back, she was watching him. Her voice came softer this time. You don't have to keep me here. I know. I'll leave as soon as I can walk. I won't bring trouble to your door. I already opened it, he said simply. You being here don't change that. Lydia stared at him. Why are you doing this? Elijah didn't have a good answer. Not one that would make sense to her, or to anyone else, really. All he knew was that something about her made the empty corners of the house seem less cold. You remind me of someone, he said finally. Not in looks, just in the way you carry pain, like it's stitched into your skin. Lydia's throat worked as she swallowed. Her fingers tightened on the quilt. I'll go into town later, Elijah added, gentler now. See if Doc Baines is back. Maybe pick up supplies. She nodded. I could make a list. You don't have to do anything. But I want to. It was the first thing she'd said that didn't sound like it came from fear. He gave a short nod and turned toward the door. I'll make coffee. You hungry? Not yet, she murmured. Then after a pause, thank you, Mr. Carter. Elijah, he corrected. She smiled faintly. Then thank you, Elijah. He closed the door behind him, leaving her in the quiet warmth of the room. Outside, the wind had picked up. It whistled through the eaves and rustled the dry grass along the porch steps. But inside that room, for the first time in what felt like forever, there was stillness. Not just silence, something steadier. Something that felt a little like peace. The next 2 days passed like breath held underwater. Lydia barely left the bed, her body slow to heal, though the fever had broken. She slept often, drifting in and out, while Elijah kept watch, splitting his time between nursing her and keeping the ranch from falling further into ruin. He fed the animals, fixed a loose shutter, patched a hole in the barn roof. He hadn't realized how many chores he'd let slip until he had someone new watching. It wasn't that Lydia asked anything of him, quite the opposite. But knowing she was in that back bedroom, her quiet presence filling up space where there had only been silence, it did something to a man. On the third morning, Elijah returned from the pasture and found her sitting up, propped against a pillow, reading the label of a jar from the pantry with narrowed eyes. You're up, he said, surprised. I'm bored, she replied. Her voice was thin, but her posture was stronger. And you're low on flour, he raised an eyebrow. You making a shopping list or planning to bake? She gave him a look that hovered somewhere between amused and defiant. If I'm going to be a burden, I might as well be a useful one. You're not a burden. Her fingers tightened on the jar, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then quietly, I know what people must think. About me being here. About what I must be to a man like you. Elijah leaned a shoulder against the doorframe, arms crossed. You're not what they think, whatever that is. Her eyes narrowed, voice sharper than before. Go on, say it. You think I'm trouble. Everyone else does. Elijah's brow lifted, calm but firm. I think you're assuming a lot for someone who hasn't heard me out. That gave her pause. She opened her mouth, then stopped. Fine. I'm listening. Her eyes met his, direct for once. And what do you think I am? I think you're someone who's been hurt and got back up anyway. He shrugged. That's more than most. She blinked, a little taken aback. Then slowly, a ghost of a smile tugged at her mouth. You always talk like that? Like what? Like you've been living in a novel no one finished writing. He huffed out something that might have been a laugh. Maybe I have. Lydia set the jar aside and looked down at the quilt draped over her lap. This house. It's quiet, but not empty. Feels like it used to be full. Elijah's smile faded. It was. Wife? He nodded once. Mary. She died 2 winters ago. Fever. I'm sorry. He didn't say me too. Didn't need to. The silence between them felt respectful now, not strained. I didn't mean to take her room, Lydia said softly. I can move if... No, he said too quickly. Then more gently. She'd have wanted someone to use it. She hated seeing things go to waste. Lydia nodded, her eyes flicking toward the window. Did you love her? Yes. She didn't ask anything more. He appreciated that. Later, as Elijah chopped firewood beneath the gray sky, he caught sight of Lydia at the window watching him. She didn't hide or look away when he noticed, just stayed still, eyes distant. He thought of the way she'd spoken his name that morning, and how she'd said thank you without sounding afraid. There was a shift happening. Not fast, not loud, but steady like thaw after a long freeze. That afternoon, she asked if she could help with supper. Elijah hesitated, then nodded and pulled a stool into the kitchen for her. She moved slow, wincing when she reached too high, but she didn't complain. Instead, she rolled up her sleeves and chopped potatoes like a woman who'd once done it 1,000 times. When he handed her a tin of dried thyme, her fingers brushed his. The contact startled them both, but neither pulled away right away. Her skin was still cool, still fragile, but she was present, fully, visibly alive in a way she hadn't been when she arrived. As the stew simmered, Elijah found himself asking, "What did you do before?" Lydia stirred the pot carefully. "I was supposed to be a teacher. Took the exam twice, passed the second time." "Supposed to?" She gave a small shrug. "Didn't turn out that way." "Why not?" "My father got sick. Mama needed help with the younger ones." A pause. Then the letters came. The advertisements seemed like a way to ease the burden back home. Ruthie was the prettier one, the confident one. Everyone thought she'd go. "But you did." Lydia didn't answer right away. Then softly, "Sometimes you don't choose a road. It just opens in front of you, and walking feels easier than standing still." Elijah nodded slowly. "That's how I ended up with this ranch." She glanced at him, curious. "My brother got the family store. I got the land nobody wanted. Figured if I could make something of it, maybe I'd prove something." "Did you?" "Don't know yet." The kettle whistled. Elijah moved to pour the tea. Lydia watched him, her expression unreadable. Then as he handed her a cup, she asked, "Do you ever think of leaving?" "Sometimes," he admitted, "but I'm not sure where I'd go." She sipped quietly. "That makes two of us." As night settled around the house, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks like a distant song. Elijah added more wood to the stove. Lydia leaned back in her chair, cradling her cup like it held the only warmth in the world. It struck him then how normal this all felt, like they were two people just sharing a quiet evening after a long day. Not a broken man and a bruised stranger stitched together by circumstance. "Do you want to stay?" he asked, the question sudden in the space between them. Lydia blinked. "You mean tonight?" "I mean longer." Her eyes searched his face, uncertain. "I'm not asking anything of you," he said quickly. It wouldn't be right to send you back out into the cold." Silence fell again. Not awkward, just weighty. Finally, Lydia nodded once. For now. That was all he needed. The next week passed in quiet rhythm. The days folded into each other, simple and steady. Elijah fixed the porch steps. Lydia swept out the dust that had gathered in corners. Even the wind seemed to have forgotten. Meals were modest. Stew, cornmeal biscuits, whatever vegetables he could coax from the tired garden, but shared without the long silences that had once ruled the house. Lydia's bruises faded. The cut at her temple left a faint line, but the haunted look that had shadowed her eyes began to lift. She still startled at sudden sounds, still glanced behind her shoulder when the wind whistled too sharp, but she stayed. That, Elijah knew, was no small thing. One evening, while gathering kindling near the fence line, Elijah noticed a boot print, too large to be his, too recent to be old. He knelt beside it, frowning, tracing the edge with 2 fingers. The soil was still soft beneath the surface, and the print faced the house. A watcher. He straightened slowly, heart thudding in a slow, steady drumbeat. The prairie stretched out flat and open, no sign of anyone now. Just the wind curling through the tall grass and the long shadows of dusk slipping across the ground. That night, he said nothing to Lydia. She was humming again, a soft tune with no words, folding linens by the hearth. Her hair was still damp from washing, tucked behind her ears. The domesticity of it all, the folded cloth, the way her feet tucked beneath her chair, the scent of wild sage from her soap, it felt almost dangerous in its normalcy. He didn't want to shatter it with the weight of what he'd seen, but the next morning he found another footprint, this time near the barn. They were being watched. When he brought it up, Lydia's face drained of color. "Elijah," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "He'll come for me. I knew he would." "Who?" She hesitated. Then, Elias Danner. The name landed heavy in the air. He's the man you ran from, Elijah asked. Lydia nodded slowly. He wasn't always cruel. Not at first. His letters were kind. Promised me a home, a future. But the closer the train came to his town, the more controlling his instructions became. How I should wear my hair, what I should call him, what I should leave behind. She swallowed hard, eyes fixed on the floor. He met me with a preacher, said he'd already paid the matchmaker and signed the contract. Said I owed him. Elijah clenched his fists. You don't owe him a damn thing. Lydia's mouth trembled. When I said no, he hit me, dragged me toward the wagon. I slipped away when the horses spooked. I ran, caught the next train out with no ticket and a busted shoulder. I've been running ever since. Then it's time you stopped, Elijah said. And it's time I started standing between you and men like that. She met his gaze. There was something different in her eyes now. Less fear, more resolve. Are you sure? If he comes, I've faced worse things than men who think they own others, Elijah said, his voice firm. I buried a wife, Lydia. I watched this land go dry and wild. I've already lost more than I thought I could stand. I'm not losing you, too. That night, he cleaned his rifle, laying out the ammunition beside it like pieces of quiet defiance. Lydia slept with the old revolver tucked beneath her pillow again. But this time, she didn't flinch when Elijah touched her shoulder to wake her for breakfast. This time, she reached for his hand. The next day, Elijah rode to town for supplies. He returned just before sundown, wagon bed loaded with sacks of flour, oats, beans, and a new lock for the front door. But the minute he stepped onto the porch, he knew something was wrong. The house was too quiet. He pushed through the door and found Lydia standing in the center of the room, white-faced and shaking. There was a man, she said. He didn't knock, just stood out there watching. I stayed inside like you told me, but he left something. Elijah followed her to the porch. A single object sat on the step, a glove, men's leather, worn thin at the knuckles. Inside, a folded scrap of paper. She belongs to me. I'm coming soon. No name, no signature, just a promise. Elijah folded the note carefully, like he might crumple the thread if he pressed too hard. We'll be ready, he said. Lydia didn't speak for a moment. Then she looked up at him, eyes clearer than he'd ever seen them. I don't want to run anymore. You won't, he promised. That night they ate in silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because they both knew the words would come later, when they were needed most. And when Elijah checked the front door one last time before bed, he turned and found Lydia already waiting by the window, revolver in hand. This time, he didn't tell her to sleep. He just pulled up a chair beside her, set his rifle across his lap, and nodded. Whatever comes, he said, we face it together. She reached out and touched his hand, small fingers curling around calloused ones. And for the first time in a long while, the ghosts at the edge of Elijah's fields didn't feel quite so close. By the third morning, the wind shifted. It wasn't just the scent of rain on the horizon or the eerie stillness that settled over the prairie. It was the weight in Elijah's bones, an ache that came before trouble, like the silence before a gunshot. He'd known that feeling during cattle raids, bad seasons, and the long winter after Mary died. This time it came with the sound of hoofbeats. Lydia was in the barn tending to a spooked chicken that had decided to nest in the hayloft. Elijah stepped out of the house with his rifle in hand, not even bothering to sling it over his shoulder. He saw the first rider crest the ridge just past the creek bed, then the second, and the third. They rode slow, deliberate, not charging, not hiding, just coming. They want to be seen, he muttered under his breath. By the time Lydia appeared at his side, a line of dust stretched behind the riders like a banner of warning. Her face was pale, but her spine was straight. She held her revolver with both hands. That's him, she said. Her voice didn't tremble. Elijah, that's Elias Danner. Danner was a tall man with sharp features and a mouth twisted into a permanent smirk. His black coat fluttered like a crow's wings. 2 men rode with him, hired guns by the look of them. Hard eyes, rough hands, no wedding bands or conscience. As they dismounted near the edge of the yard, Danner called out, McGrath, come on out. Let's not make this messy. Elijah stepped forward, Lydia a breath behind him. I figure you made it messy when you left her bleeding at a train station, he said, voice calm but loud enough to carry. Danner's grin widened. Now that's a fine story, but the way I heard it, she ran off after promising herself to a man. Broke contract. That makes her mine. Elijah didn't move. She's not livestock, Danner. She's not property. She's my wife. Danner's smirk faltered, just for a second. Convenient that. Marrying her the day she shows up, like you knew I'd come looking. I married her because she needed safety, Elijah said, and I aim to keep her safe. One of Danner's men spat in the dirt. The other unbuttoned his coat, revealing the holster beneath. Elijah didn't flinch. You looking to talk or start a war? Danner dismounted, boots crunching on the dry earth. Let's be civil, McGrath. I got paperwork from the matchmaker, signed by her father. I paid good money. She can come quiet or not. That's her choice. Lydia stepped forward then, so fast Elijah almost missed it. My father forged my name. He sold me without asking. That contract's void. Danner laughed. That's so. Then show me the annulment. Got a judge's stamp? I've got a marriage license, Elijah cut in, signed by Preacher Ellison and filed at the county office 3 days ago. That shut Danner up. The wind picked up then, kicking dust across the field. Somewhere a hawk cried above them. I don't care what piece of paper you have, Danner snarled. She was promised to me. You promised to treat her like a wife, not a prisoner, Elijah replied. You failed the minute you put your hands on her. There was a pause, a long, thick silence where everyone held their breath. Danner's hand twitched. So did Elijah's. Then, like lightning, one of the hired guns drew his pistol. Lydia fired first. Her shot was clean, practiced. The man staggered backward, hit the ground, and didn't move again. Elijah didn't hesitate. He turned his rifle on the second man, pulled the trigger, and watched him dive behind the trough. The bullet caught his thigh as he fell. He screamed and didn't get back up. Danner ducked, grabbing for his own gun, but Elijah was already moving. He tackled him hard, the two men hitting the ground in a cloud of dust and curses. Danner clawed at Elijah's coat, fists flying wild. Elijah, though older, was stronger and fueled by something meaner than anger, righteous fury. He punched Danner once, twice, until the man's nose bled and his cocky grin vanished. I should end this, Elijah growled, pressing the barrel of his rifle to the man's chest. But I want you to walk away. I want you to live knowing she chose me. Not because I forced her, because I gave her something you never could. Respect Danner spit blood, his voice a rasp. She'll regret this. She hasn't yet. Elijah stood, stepped back, and watched Danner stagger to his feet. He limped toward his horse, casting a final glare at Lydia, who still stood firm, revolver in hand, eyes cold as frost. Danner climbed into the saddle, groaning. You'll regret this too, McGrath. I've already lost a wife, Elijah said quietly. You can't scare me. The remaining gunman dragged himself toward his mount. Danner gave a sharp whistle, and they rode off, slow and bitter. When they were gone, Elijah turned to Lydia. She was trembling now, shoulders shaking. He rushed to her. You hurt? She shook her head. Number just. It's over, isn't it? He pulled her into his arms. I think it is. For a long moment, they just held each other. Around them, the prairie was quiet again. Later, when the sun sank low and the bodies were buried, Elijah lit the hearth. Lydia stood at the stove, stirring beans with one hand, a fresh bandage on her arm. He watched her in the lamplight, strength beneath the soft. What now? She asked softly. Elijah took her hand. Now, he said, we start living like they're never coming back. And Lydia, for the first time since stepping off that train, smiled like she believed it. The first light of morning filtered through the slats in the barn, painting the hayloft in warm gold. Elijah woke with a start, the faint ache in his back reminding him he'd fallen asleep on the cot in the tack room again. He sat up slowly, stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. Lydia had insisted he rest inside, but he'd stayed close to the barn all the same. Even with Danner run off, there was still a shadow on the land, a habit of looking over one's shoulder that wouldn't fade overnight. But this morning there was peace in the stillness. He stepped outside, boots crunching over dry straw, and saw Lydia in the yard, her braid trailing down her back, apron dusted with flour, and a soft smile on her lips as she shooed away a chicken that had no business near the porch. The house behind her had changed. Nothing drastic, just little things. The curtains no longer hung limp. The shutters were mended. There were flowers in a chipped enamel pot by the door. It looked lived in again. Loved even. She looked up and saw him. "You're up late," she teased. "It's barely past dawn," he replied. "That's what I said." Her grin widened, but it faded as she studied his face. "You didn't sleep again, did you?" "Some," he lied, and she knew it. She walked toward him, wiping her hands on her apron. "You don't have to keep watch every night, Elijah. He's gone." "He may be," he said, "but worry sticks longer than any outlaw." She didn't argue, just slipped her hand into his. "So does love." They stood together for a while, watching the sun lift over the ridge like it had a dozen times before. But this time it felt different. Warmer. Less like survival, more like beginning. "You know," she said quietly, "when I first got off that train, I didn't think I'd last a day here. I figured I'd either run or vanish." Elijah's grip tightened around hers. "And now?" he asked. "Now," she said, "I'm thinking about planting wildflowers. The good kind. The ones that fight to grow where no one thinks they will." Later that afternoon, Elijah found her kneeling by the fence, planting marigolds where the ground cracked, just to see if anything would bloom. Elijah chuckled. "Sounds familiar." They spent the morning cleaning out the shed near the chicken coop, what had once been Mary's garden shed. Lydia had tiptoed around it for weeks, never asking, always waiting for permission, without knowing if she had it. Today, Elijah handed her the key. Inside, the dust hung thick and the air was stale. But the bones were good. A rusted hoe leaned in the corner beside a cracked watering can. On the shelf, a leather-bound book, Mary's planting journal, waited like it had always expected someone to open it again. Lydia picked it up gently. "She kept notes on every flower." "Every seed," Elijah said, "even made up names for the strays that came in on the wind." Lydia flipped through a few pages. She had a tender heart. "She did." He paused. "You remind me of her, sometimes. Not in looks or voice. Just, in the way you fight quiet, in how you find beauty in broken things." She closed the journal. "That's kind of you to say. It's not kindness, just truth." In the days that followed, they made slow progress. Lydia dug up the garden plot, her hands blistered but proud. Elijah repaired the broken window in the parlor, then built a small bench for her to rest on near the porch. Together, they walked the fence lines, checking for loose boards and watching the horizon. Not in fear, but in wonder. Lydia collected river stones, stacking them in odd little towers near the barn. "For luck," she claimed. One evening, a wagon rolled into the yard. It was Sheriff Callahan, alone this time, hat in hand and dust on his boots. "Just checking in," he said. "Had word Danner's left the territory. Heard he's licking his wounds in Kansas." Elijah nodded. "Hope the wind takes him farther." The sheriff glanced at Lydia. "You're looking well, Mrs. Carter." She smiled, small and sure. "I am well." The sheriff lingered a moment, then pulled a small envelope from his coat. "Found this in the office, addressed to Elijah. Looks old." Inside was a letter faded with time. It was from Mary. A letter written years ago, sealed and forgotten at the bottom of some old desk drawer. Elijah read it in silence. At the end it said, "If something ever happens to me, don't let the light go out in that house. Let it be full of laughter again. Let someone plant wildflowers, even if they bloom where I never did." He folded it with care and slipped it into Lydia's garden book. That night, as the wind danced through the prairie grass, they sat on the porch. Lydia leaned into Elijah's side, his arm curled around her shoulders. Her head rested on his chest, rising and falling with each breath. "I didn't think I'd get this," she whispered. "This?" he asked. "A home, a man who sees me, a life that doesn't begin and end in fear." He kissed her hair. "You didn't just get it, Lydia," he said. "You built it. You fought for it." The stars came out one by one. The coyote cried in the distance. Somewhere in the dark, the wildflowers were already reaching for the light. Tomorrow there'd be work to do, fences to mend, a garden to tend, maybe even a neighbor to call on. now that the gossip had softened into respect. But tonight was quiet, safe, home. And so, on windswept land where dust clings to memory, a woman fleeing her past found a man still haunted by his. A broken ranch, two wounded hearts, and a spring no one expected. Perhaps fate doesn't shout, it whispers. And perhaps love doesn't arrive in grand declarations, but in quiet glances and the sound of boots beside yours. Now tell me this, where do the deepest bonds take root? In longing, in loss, or in courage? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Did Lydia's strength move you more, or Elijah's silent devotion? Until we meet again in the next story, remember, the strongest roots are the ones that hold after the storm.